In the grand halls of Tudor England, power didn't just rest on the throne, it lingered behind locked doors. Every glance, every whisper, every touch inside the royal chambers was dictated by one man's obsession. King Henry VIII, one of history's most infamous rulers, demanded control over everything: his kingdom, his wives, and even their most private moments. But behind the gold, the velvet, and the divine crowns lay a world that was anything but regal. Inside his palaces, love was not love. Desire was a weapon. Women were inspected like livestock. Servants were ordered to watch in silence. And what the king called holy purity became a twisted game of humiliation. These are the 8 horrifying bedroom rules of Henry VIII, the secrets his court tried desperately to erase. Because sometimes, the most terrifying parts of history happen in bed. You think you know Henry VIII, the bloated tyrant with 6 wives and a mountain of executions. But behind every political scandal lay something even darker: a man consumed by obsession, shame, and a grotesque fear of inadequacy. Describe his early charisma and education, the trauma of losing male heirs, and how divine right paranoia fused with sexual insecurity to breed cruelty. He was called God's chosen king, but behind the walls of his glittering palaces, Henry Tudor was less a divine ruler and more a man haunted by his own body. His court chroniclers painted him as the embodiment of strength: tall, broad-shouldered, commanding, the very image of English majesty. But beneath the velvet and jewels was a restless, insecure creature whose appetites ruled him far more than he ruled his kingdom. The history books remember his 6 wives, his political brilliance, and his cruelty. But what they rarely mention are the rules, the unholy, humiliating commandments that governed his most private world. Henry's hunger for power was matched only by his hunger for control. To him, the royal bedchamber was not a sanctuary, it was a throne of flesh. It was the place where lineage began, where the legitimacy of kings was forged between sheets soaked in politics. And so, intimacy became law. His desire was not driven by passion but by duty, obsession, and fear. Every moment behind those heavy doors was watched, whispered about, and later reported to the highest circles of court intrigue. There was nothing private about the king's pleasure. On his wedding nights, courtiers stood outside the chamber, their ears pressed to the carved oak. It wasn't romance they waited for, it was proof. The royal physicians and attendants were ordered to inspect the bed linens the next morning, searching for the telltale marks of consummation. The act of love became a public ceremony, a grotesque ritual of state. The sheets themselves, sometimes displayed discreetly to select members of the court, were treated as political evidence that the union had been made pure. No wife could refuse the summons of the king, no matter her illness, fear, or exhaustion. To deny him was to defy God himself. Henry's obsession with proving his manhood was both spiritual and pathological. He believed his inability to produce a healthy male heir was a divine punishment for sin. And yet, in the same breath, he blamed his wives for the failures of his bloodline. The women he married, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, each entered his chambers knowing that what happened there could determine their life or death. Their worth was measured in children, in purity, and in obedience. Love was irrelevant. The king's mood dictated everything. Courtiers learned to read the subtle signs. The tension in his jaw, the storm behind his eyes, the moment his patience began to unravel. Servants were trained to maintain silence when he summoned a wife to his chambers, to prepare the bedding, to light the perfumed candles, to pretend not to hear the cries of a man torn between desire and rage. Even in his youth, Henry's appetites were infamous. He viewed women as both sacred vessels and disposable instruments. When a wife no longer pleased him, or failed to bear him a son, he invoked scripture to justify her destruction. The concept of refusal did not exist. To Henry, consent was a formality reserved for commoners. The queen's body was an extension of the crown, and the crown belonged to him. He demanded his queens to be both virginal and endlessly available. They were expected to appear delicate yet compliant, spiritual yet seductive, motherly yet untouched. The contradiction was impossible. Many of his wives lived in a state of quiet terror, performing the duties expected of them under the watchful eyes of priests, attendants, and spies. Every detail of their private lives was catalogued. Midwives recorded the queen's cycle, doctors examined her diet, and courtiers tracked her fertility as though she were a piece of livestock in a royal stable. Certain foods were banned at specific times of the month. Certain prayers were ordered to cleanse the womb before the king's visits. The ritual of intimacy became mechanical, stripped of affection and dictated by superstition. Henry viewed the female body as a tool of divine purpose, its every function subject to his command. When the queen fell ill, she was blamed for tempting God's wrath. When she miscarried, it was whispered that her blood was impure. When she could not conceive, it was said the devil had closed her womb. These rumors were not accidents, they were weapons. They justified the king's rage, and they provided a righteous excuse for betrayal. To question Henry's authority, even in the secrecy of a chamber, was to court death. His paranoia extended into every shadow of his bedchamber. Servants were rotated frequently to prevent alliances, and anyone caught gossiping about the royal couple was punished severely. There were nights when the palace was silent, yet tension pulsed through the corridors. Behind locked doors, Henry's fear of divine punishment turned to cruelty. His wives were forced to submit to rituals that he claimed were blessed by scripture, purity inspections, prayers before the act, and endless confessions of obedience. These rituals were not about faith. They were about power. He was a man terrified of losing control over the one thing he could never truly command: life itself. The women closest to him learned to mask their dread behind smiles. They were dressed in gowns that weighed more than a child, their bodies bound in fabric so tight it bruised the skin. Each stitch, each jewel, each drop of perfume was chosen to please him, to conceal fatigue, to disguise fear. When the king entered, everyone else left. But their absence did not mean privacy. Courtiers lingered nearby. Servants carried trays of wine, pretending not to hear what unfolded. Every touch, every sigh, every word of the king could become gossip by morning. There was no greater humiliation than the public proof of chastity. In a world ruled by appearances, a queen's virtue was currency. When the king lost interest, the very same courtiers who once praised her beauty would whisper of her corruption. Her body, once celebrated, became the evidence of sin. The palace operated on rumor, and Henry cultivated that fear. By keeping everyone afraid, he remained untouchable. When his second wife, Anne Boleyn, began to show defiance, his anger turned biblical. She had promised him a son and given him a daughter. Her wit, once her greatest weapon, became her curse. The court that had once admired her intelligence began to label her as dangerous. Whispers spread that she used dark charms to ensnare the king. These rumors were not born from superstition. They were orchestrated by Henry's advisors, eager to justify what would come next. In his mind, disobedience was betrayal, and betrayal was treason. Anne's execution was the ultimate act of purification. Her death was meant to cleanse not only the court but the bed she once shared with him. Even after her death, Henry remained obsessed with control. His queens were expected to maintain strict rituals of cleanliness, especially during their cycles. If a queen bled, her attendants documented it. She was separated from the king for 7 days, after which she would undergo a cleansing bath prepared by royal servants and blessed by priests. The ritual was intended to restore purity before the next conjugal summons. The body was no longer personal, it was ceremonial, political, divine property. By middle age, Henry's body began to betray him. His once athletic frame swelled with disease. His legs, ulcerated and festering, oozed beneath his robes. The smell of rot filled the palace, so strong that courtiers carried scented herbs in their sleeves to mask it. Yet even as his flesh decayed, his pride did not. He still demanded his wives to approach him as if he were godlike, perfect, irresistible. The contradiction was grotesque. A dying man demanding worship in the name of divine masculinity. Servants were ordered to prepare the king's bed with precision. Layers of linen were arranged to absorb the fluids from his sores. The bedposts were modified with iron handles to help him rise from the mattress. At times, it took several men to lift him. Yet when the curtains closed, the same king who could barely stand insisted on performing his conjugal duties. Failure to do so, he believed, would invite mockery and rebellion. To the outside world, Henry's potency symbolized strength. To him, it was the last illusion of control he had left. There were times when the queen's attendants could hear him screaming in pain, his ulcers bursting under pressure, his rage filling the room like thunder. Still, no one dared intervene. To interrupt the king was to risk your life. When the act was over, silence returned, and the servants came in to wash the blood-stained sheets. These were not nights of love but nights of survival. The palace became a machine of secrecy. Every word, every movement was monitored. Spies hid among the laundrymaids, the grooms, the cooks. The smallest gesture, a look, a hesitation, a whisper, could be twisted into treason. Queens learned that affection was dangerous. Even a shared glance with another man could be fatal. Catherine Howard, young and naive, paid the price for this cruel paranoia. Her alleged infidelities were exaggerated, her supposed lovers tortured until they confessed. Her execution was swift, her body displayed as a warning to every woman who followed. The message was simple. The king's body was sacred, but yours was disposable. The church, which had once defied him, became his accomplice. Henry had broken with Rome to legitimize his desires, and now his priests twisted scripture to justify his cruelty. They preached that the king's will was God's will, that obedience was salvation, and that disobedience was sin. His bedroom became an altar of power, and every queen was both worshipper and sacrifice. In those final years, the man who once saw himself as the Lion of England was reduced to a rotting carcass of paranoia. His skin turned pale and blistered. His teeth blackened. The ulcers on his legs refused to heal, filling his chambers with the stench of infection. He could no longer ride a horse, could barely walk without pain, yet still insisted that courtiers bow to his every step. When he looked in the mirror, he saw not a monster but a martyr, a man chosen by God to bear the suffering of kingship. He spoke of divine tests, of demons sent to tempt him, and of wives who had failed to keep his soul pure. His last wife, Catherine Parr, played the role of nurse more than spouse. She bathed his wounds, changed his bandages, and listened to his endless self-pity. She survived where others had perished not because of love, but because she understood him. She gave him the one thing he could no longer command, gentleness. But even she knew that behind the fragile mercy lay a man whose shame ruled his every breath. The walls of Whitehall, Hampton Court, and Greenwich whispered the same truth. There was no peace in the king's bed. It was a battlefield where faith, fear, and flesh collided. Servants moved like ghosts through the corridors, carrying trays of linen and herbs, avoiding the king's gaze. They knew that one wrong word could end a life. In the end, Henry VIII died surrounded not by love but by superstition. His final words were not confessions of sin, but mutterings about divine favor. The same church that had once crowned him God's instrument now whispered prayers for his tormented soul. When his body was laid in the tomb, the stench was so overpowering that mourners covered their faces with cloth. His death was a relief to everyone but himself. And yet, the rules he created, the rituals of shame, the inspections, the fear of impurity, did not die with him. They became part of a legacy of control that stretched far beyond his lifetime. The idea that women's bodies could be governed, measured, and punished in the name of power survived the centuries. His bedchamber was just the beginning. It was there that politics met flesh, that fear masqueraded as holiness, and that one man's lust for dominance became the blueprint for tyranny. When we remember Henry VIII, we often picture the obese tyrant, the executioner's block, the severed heads. But his greatest cruelty was quieter. It hid behind closed doors. It was in the way he turned intimacy into law, love into obligation, faith into fear. The women who shared his bed paid with their lives, their dignity, and their humanity. Their stories remind us that the true horror of power is not in the battlefield or the throne room. It's in the silence of the bedroom, where the screams were never meant to be heard.